Robert F. Kennedy won the California Democratic primary. He walked to the podium at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles. The crowd was electric. The campaign had been 85 days long. He had traveled through the poorest parts of America. He had seen things that changed him. He had come to believe that the country was ready for something different. He gave a victory speech that people who were in that room would describe for the rest of their lives. Then someone told him there was a back route through the hotel kitchen that would get him to the press conference faster. He went through the kitchen. Sirhan Sirhan was waiting. 3 shots were fired. Robert Kennedy went down. And in the chaos that erupted around him, in the screaming and the surging and the terrible confusion of a room that had just become a crime scene, one person remained completely still. She was crouching over him on the floor. She was whispering to him. When the crowd pressed in around them, she turned and pushed them back. She asked them with a composure that no photograph has ever fully explained to give him air. Her name was Ethel Kennedy. She was 40 years old. She was 3 months pregnant with their 11th child. She had 10 children at home. And the man she was crouching over on that kitchen floor was the person she had loved since she was 17 years old, standing in front of a fireplace at a ski lodge in Quebec, and had never, in 23 years of marriage, stopped loving completely. He died the following day. And here is what happened in the 56 years that followed that kitchen floor. I am Mary. And today we are going to talk about Ethel Kennedy, not the sanitized version, not the cautionary tale, not the widow who got left behind by history while everyone else moved forward. The real one. The woman who was simultaneously one of the most remarkable human beings the Kennedy world ever produced and one of the most complicated. The woman who founded a human rights organization in the months before she gave birth to her last child. Who got arrested at the age of 80 for chaining herself to a protest outside the White House. Who buried a husband, 2 sons, and enough grief to have broken anyone 10 times over, and who showed up anyway, decade after decade, in rooms where she believed things could still be made better. The woman who was crouching on that kitchen floor in 1968 is the same woman who was marching for farm workers' rights in Palm Beach in 2016 at 88 years old. That is not a sad story. That is something considerably more interesting than a sad story. Stay with me. Before any of the grief, before the Ambassador Hotel, before the assassinations and the losses and the 56 years of keeping going, there was a girl in Greenwich, Connecticut, who was described by the nuns who taught her as thoroughly herself. What that phrase actually meant, and what it told you about everything that followed, is coming. To understand what Ethel Kennedy was made of, you have to go back to Greenwich, Connecticut, in the 1930s. Not to a quiet house on a modest street. Not to a family that valued stillness or composure or the careful management of appearances. To a 31-room English country manor on Lake Avenue, with horses and dogs and chickens and 6 siblings, and a father who had started as an $8-a-week railroad clerk and built, through sheer force of will, one of the most successful privately held energy companies in America, the Great Lakes Carbon Corporation. George Skakel had done something that the world, the Kennedys inhabited, the world of inherited wealth and ancient Catholic money and political dynasties, had not done. He had built it from nothing. He was the son of a Protestant Dutch family. He married a devout Irish Catholic woman named Anne Branagh. Together they produced 7 children, and together they raised those children in a house where the most important rule was that you never stopped moving. Ethel was the 6th of 7, born the 11th of April, 1928, in Chicago. 5 years old when the family moved east. 8 years old when they finally settled into the Lake Avenue Manor in Greenwich for good. Now here is what you need to understand about the Skakel household before you can understand anything else about Ethel Kennedy. It was not a Kennedy household. The Kennedys, Joseph Sr.'s household, ran on discipline, on ambition, on the specific cold calculation of a patriarch who had decided that his children were going to be great whether they wanted to be or not. There were rules in the Kennedy household. There were expectations. There were consequences. The Skakels ran on something else entirely. They ran on chaos. Deliberate, joyful, slightly unhinged chaos. Animals moved through the house with the same freedom as people. The children were competitive in the specific way that large families with too much energy and too much space become competitive physically, constantly, without any particular concern for what got broken in the process. Discipline was not, as one account put it, a house specialty. Ethel, in particular, was what the adults in her life tended to describe, with varying levels of affection, as thoroughly herself. She was tomboyish, she was loud, she was fearlessly competitive in a way that her brothers found uncomfortable and her sisters found exhausting. She played sports with a recklessness that suggested she had not fully considered the possibility of injury. She pulled pranks. She questioned authority not in a sullen or resentful way, but in the specific, relentless way of someone who had been told a rule existed and genuinely wanted to know why. She attended the all-girls Greenwich Academy, then the convent of the Sacred Heart in the Bronx, where the nuns, by multiple accounts, found her challenging. Not unkind, not deliberately difficult, simply resistant to the specific, enforced stillness that convent school education required of its students. The nuns did their best. Ethel remained thoroughly herself. She graduated in 1945, and in September of that year, she enrolled at Manhattanville College of the Sacred Heart in New York. This is where the story changes direction. She was assigned a roommate, a girl named Jean Kennedy, daughter of Joseph and Rose Kennedy of Massachusetts, sister to John and Robert and Ted and the rest of the family, whose name was already beginning to carry the specific weight of American political mythology. Jean and Ethel became fast friends almost immediately. Shared Catholicism, shared love of competition, shared talent for getting their names into the disciplinary records. The Manhattanville Demerit book, which documented student infractions, eventually disappeared. It had been stolen and incinerated. Nobody seemed to know exactly who was responsible. Those who knew Ethel Skakel at the time had their suspicions. In December of 1945, Jean Kennedy brought Ethel on a ski trip to Mont Tremblant Resort in Quebec, Canada. Ethel was 17 years old, and standing in front of a roaring fireplace in that ski lodge was Jean's brother, Robert Francis Kennedy, 20 years old, dark-haired, serious in a way that his older brother John was not. The kind of young man who asked questions and actually waited for the answers, who had just finished his service in the Navy and was heading back to Harvard, who commanded attention without appearing to seek it. Ethel noticed him immediately. The problem, and this detail matters, because it tells you something specific about Ethel's character that the rest of her life would confirm, was that Robert was not interested in Ethel. He was interested in her older sister Patricia. He began dating Patricia Skakel, and Ethel, who had fallen for him at that fireplace, with the specific, total certainty of a 17-year-old who has never had a reason to doubt her own instincts, waited. 2 years. She watched from the sidelines, while the man she had decided she was going to love was in a relationship with her own sister. She described this period in later life, in the 2012 documentary her daughter Rory made about her, as a black period, not with bitterness, not with resentment toward Patricia, simply with the rueful honesty of someone looking back at a time when they wanted something very badly and had no power to make it happen faster. When Robert and Patricia's relationship ended, when Robert turned his attention toward Ethel, she did not hesitate. They became engaged in February 1950. They were married on the 17th of June 1950 at St. Mary's Catholic Church in Greenwich, Connecticut. The Boston Globe covered the wedding and noted that the marriage united 2 large fortunes. Ethel did not care about the large fortunes. She had married the man she had been watching since that fireplace in Quebec 5 years earlier. She was 22 years old, and she was certain about him, in a way she would remain certain for the rest of her life. Here is what nobody at that wedding could have known, and what the story of Ethel Kennedy requires you to hold from this moment forward. The girl who had grown up in organized chaos, who had survived the nuns, who had stolen and incinerated the demerit book, who had waited 2 years for a man her own sister had been dating, who was loud and competitive and thoroughly herself in every room she entered. That girl was about to walk into the Kennedy world, and the Kennedy world was not built for people like her. It was built for people who could be managed, Ethel Skakel could not be managed, and that specific, documented fact, her refusal to be diminished by the institution she had married into, is the thing that made everything that followed either remarkable or unbearable, depending on which account you read. Both accounts are correct. The Kennedy world had a specific, institutional requirement for the women inside it. A requirement that Joan Kennedy tried to meet and was destroyed by. A requirement that Jackie Kennedy mastered at enormous personal cost. And a requirement that Ethel Kennedy, the girl who incinerated the Demerit book, responded to in a way that nobody inside that family expected. What that response looked like and what it cost is coming. There is a house in McLean, Virginia, that people who visited it in the 1960s describe in ways that sound, depending on who is telling the story, either like the most alive place they had ever been, or like a controlled riot. Hickory Hill, a white-columned Georgian revival mansion on 6 acres in the Virginia countryside, once owned by the Civil War general George McClellan, once rented to John and Jackie Kennedy in the early years of their marriage, before Jackie decided it was too large and too demanding and sold it to Robert and Ethel in 1956. Ethel Kennedy transformed it. She filled it with animals, horses, dogs, a rotating cast of them, often large, often named after people the family admired or wanted to embarrass. A sea lion named Sandy, purchased impulsively and installed in the swimming pool until the neighbors complained. Chickens. At one point, reportedly, a coatimundi, a Central American mammal that no one in the household had been entirely prepared to manage. The children, of course, loved all of it. There were a lot of children. Robert and Ethel Kennedy had 11. Kathleen, 1,951. Joseph, the second, 1,952. Robert, the third, 1,954. David, 1,955. Mary Courtney, 1,956. Michael, 1,958. Mary Carey, 1,959. Christopher, 1,963. Matthew, 1,965. Douglas, 1,967. Rory, born after her father's murder, in December 1968, 6 months after the Ambassador Hotel. 11 children in 17 years. Now here is what the sanitized version of this story does with that number. It presents it as evidence of faith, of love, of devotion to Catholic tradition, of the extraordinary capacity Ethel Kennedy had for giving and sustaining life. All of that is true, but the sanitized version stops there. And in stopping there, it misses the thing that actually matters about Hickory Hill in the 1960s. Ethel Kennedy ran that household almost entirely alone. Robert Kennedy was, by every account that exists, frequently absent. He was working first as chief counsel to the Senate Rackets Committee, then as Attorney General, then as Senator from New York, then as a presidential candidate. The work was real and it was important. Nobody disputes that. But the arithmetic of Hickory Hill was this: 11 children, 1 mother, and a husband who was fighting organized crime or desegregating the Justice Department or traveling the country trying to become the next president of the United States. The household staff was large. There were nannies, there were cooks, there were groundskeepers. But the organizing intelligence of Hickory Hill, the person who set the tone and enforced the values and decided what kind of family the Kennedys of McLean, Virginia, were going to be, that was Ethel. And the values she chose were not the Kennedy values. The Kennedy patriarch, Joseph Sr., had built his family around achievement, around winning, around the specific, pressurized ambition of a man who believed that his children were going to conquer the world, whether they had been asked to or not. The Kennedy household ran on competition and performance, and the constant, implicit threat of disappointed expectations. Hickory Hill ran on something different. It ran on faith and laughter, and deliberate, slightly absurd joy. The children were expected to attend Mass. They were expected to do their schoolwork. But they were also expected to be loud and physical and present, to argue at the dinner table, to bring their friends home, to treat Hickory Hill as a place where life actually happened, rather than a stage for managed appearances. Bobby Kennedy, Robert III, their third son, described it in later life as chaotic and warm, and entirely unlike any other house he had ever been in. Ethel organized what became known in Washington circles as the Hickory Hill Seminars. She invited intellectuals and artists and public figures to come and speak not at formal Kennedy dinners, but at actual seminars at Hickory Hill, with the family present. Robert McNamara came, Arthur Schlesinger came, historians and economists and poets came. Ethel believed, with a specific ferocity that the people around her found slightly startling, that her children should understand the world they were going to inherit, not be managed toward it, understand it. This is the Ethel Kennedy that the competitor's video does not show you. Not the grieving widow, not the reckless socialite, not the difficult employer that her former staff described in the comments section after she died. The woman who built a world inside the Kennedy institution that operated on her terms. And then, on the 22nd of November 1963, that world was interrupted for the first time. John F. Kennedy was shot in Dallas. Robert Kennedy was at Hickory Hill when the call came. He was eating lunch. The director of the CIA, John McCone, was with him. Robert took the call, went pale, put down the phone, and said 3 words. He told McCone what had happened. Then, he went inside. Ethel went to him. She was the first person in the Kennedy world to reach him. Not Rose, not Jackie, who was in Dallas at her husband's side, not the extended family. Ethel. She was at his side within minutes of the call. She held his hand in the motorcade to the airport. She stayed with him through the night that followed, which by every account was the worst night of Robert Kennedy's life. The night when the man who had defined himself through loyalty to his older brother understood that his brother was gone, and that the future he had been preparing for no longer existed in the form he had imagined. What she said to him in those hours, nobody recorded. She did not tell interviewers. She did not write about it. She held that private. But here is what every person who saw them that night, and there were many, in the terrible circus of a presidential assassination, described in the same language. She was completely steady, not numb, not in shock, not performing composure for the cameras and the history books. Steady in the specific way of a person who has decided, at some foundational level, that their function in the world is to be the thing that does not collapse when everything else does. She was 35 years old, and she had been practicing that steadiness quietly, without fanfare, without the specific type of public heroism that the Kennedy world rewarded for the 13 years since she walked into that ski lodge in Quebec and decided who she was going to love. JFK's assassination did something specific to Robert Kennedy. The people around him watched it happen in real time. He became more serious, more internally turbulent, more interested in poverty, in civil rights, in the specific, grinding human costs of the America that existed outside the Kennedy world. He traveled to Appalachia and was changed by what he saw. He traveled to the Mississippi Delta and was changed by what he saw. He began, in ways that made Joseph Sr. deeply uncomfortable and his political advisors profoundly nervous, to become the version of himself that history would eventually remember. Ethel Kennedy went with him. Not always physically, but she went with him in the specific sense that matters. She did not pull back from where he was going. She did not present him with the choice between his politics and his home. She expanded to fit the person he was becoming. She started attending civil rights events. She brought those people to Hickory Hill. She believed what he believed, and in the accounts of the people who knew them both, her belief was not derivative of his. It was her own. It came from the same Catholicism, from the same capacity for specific, grounded moral conviction that had made her who she was before she ever walked into a Kennedy room. Here is what people who criticize Ethel Kennedy, and they exist, and their criticisms are documented and real, tend to say about this period. They say she was reckless with money. She was. The Skakel fortune she had grown up with had already been diminished by the time she came into adulthood. Her parents died in a 1955 plane crash. Her brothers made decisions that reduced the inheritance substantially. She spent beyond her means consistently. There were unpaid bills. There were creditors who did not get paid. They say she was difficult to work for. Former staff described someone who was demanding and inconsistent, and who applied a double standard between how she treated people she considered equals and how she treated people she considered employees. They say she was loyal to the Kennedy institution in ways that sometimes overrode her loyalty to the individual people inside it. That last one is the one that matters. That last one is the one that 1984 will prove. But in 1963 and 1964 and 1965, and into the years that followed, Ethel Kennedy was the thing that held Hickory Hill together, while Robert Kennedy was becoming the public figure that half of America was, beginning to see as the only person who might be able to lead the country. Somewhere worth going. She managed the children. She managed the house. She managed the social and political world of a senator and presidential candidate. She did it without credit, and without complaint, and without the specific acknowledgement that the Kennedy institution routinely failed to provide to the women inside it. And she did it with the sea lion in the swimming pool, and the horses, and the coatimundi, and the 11 children at the dinner table, arguing about politics, because their mother had decided that this was what a Kennedy household was going to look like, not the cold, managed ambition of Joseph Sr.'s world, but this. Loud, full, real. That is what she built. And on June 4th, 1968, she was still building it. She was in Los Angeles with Robert. She had campaigned with him for 85 days. She had shaken hands and given speeches and stood at his side at the podium at the Ambassador Hotel while the crowd screamed and the room felt, for one specific moment, like a country that was ready for something different. Then the kitchen, then the floor, then the 56 years that followed. But you already know how that night ends. What nobody has told you yet is what she did with the morning after. The morning after Robert Kennedy died, Ethel Kennedy was 40 years old, 3 months pregnant, the mother of 10 children, with a funeral to arrange and a family to hold together, and a world that had just ended for the second time in 5 years. What she did in the 72 hours after the Ambassador Hotel, and the decision she made in those 72 hours that the Kennedy family would spend the next decade trying to control, is coming. Robert Francis Kennedy died at 1:44 a.m. in the morning on June 6, 1968. He had been shot at 12:15 a.m. on June 5th. He had survived for 26 hours. Ethel had not left the hospital. She was 40 years old, 3 months pregnant. She had 10 children at home in McLean, Virginia, who had been told by staff and relatives that their father had been hurt, not how badly, not yet, and who were waiting. When the doctors told her that Robert was gone, Ethel Kennedy did something that the nurses and staff at Good Samaritan Hospital in Los Angeles would describe for the rest of their lives. She thanked them. She stood up. She thanked the medical staff for everything they had done. She asked, calmly and specifically, about the practical arrangements that needed to be made. Then she walked out of that room and began doing what needed to be done next. This is not a story about a woman who did not grieve. This is a story about a woman who had decided at some level so deep that it operated below the reach of conscious choice that collapsing was not something she was permitted to do. The Kennedy family descended on Los Angeles within hours. Teddy Kennedy flew in. The extended family arrived. The machinery of a Kennedy death, the political apparatus, the press management, the logistical coordination of moving a body from one coast to another, with the entire world watching, began to operate with the specific, practiced efficiency of a family that had done this before. Jackie Kennedy flew from New York to Los Angeles to be with the family. And here is where the story becomes complicated, in a way that the sanitized version never tells you. Jackie Kennedy wanted to bring Robert home on Air Force Two. She wanted a state funeral. She wanted the full ceremonial weight of the American government extended to the second Kennedy brother to be murdered in 5 years. Ethel Kennedy said no. Not publicly, not in a statement. In the specific, private, unmovable way of someone who understood exactly what they were doing. She wanted Robert Kennedy brought home on a commercial flight. She wanted his body carried through the streets of New York on a flatbed train, open, visible, passing through the towns and cities where he had campaigned, where the people he had gone to meet in Appalachia and the Mississippi Delta could come and stand along the tracks and see him pass. The Kennedy family pushed back. The advisors pushed back. The people around her who believed they understood what a Kennedy death required pushed back. Ethel held. The funeral train from New York to Washington took 8 hours. It passed through Newark and Trenton and Philadelphia and Wilmington and Baltimore. People stood along the tracks, hundreds of thousands of them. They stood in fields and on highway overpasses and on the rooftops of buildings. They held signs and flags and rosaries. They wept. Some of them held their children up so the children could see. That was Ethel Kennedy's decision, not the family's, not the advisors, hers. He was buried at Arlington National Cemetery on June 8, 1968, in a ceremony attended by over 1,000 people near his brother, under a simple white cross. Ethel was the last person to stand at the grave before it was closed. Then she went home to Hickory Hill. She had 10 children at home, 1 child coming, and a family institution that, in the weeks and months that followed, would make a series of decisions about its own future that Ethel Kennedy was not invited to be part of. Here is what the Kennedy family did after Robert died. They managed his legacy. Joseph Kennedy Sr., the patriarch, had suffered a stroke in 1961 and was largely incapacitated by 1968. But the institutional logic he had built survived him. The Kennedy machine, the advisors, the political network, the financial structures, the family office moved to consolidate control of Robert Kennedy's memory in the specific way that institutions consolidate control of things that have become valuable. Ethel was Robert's widow. She received the house. She received the trust funds for the children. She received the respect and the public deference that a Kennedy widow was owed. What she did not receive was power. She was not consulted on decisions about Robert's papers, his political legacy, his public image. She was not included in the conversations about what the Kennedy name would do next. She was, in the specific language of the institution, managed. She had been in that institution for 18 years. She knew exactly what was happening, and she made a choice. She was not going to be managed. In December 1968, 6 months after the Ambassador Hotel, 6 months after the funeral train, in the same month that the last of her 11 children was born, Ethel Kennedy named her daughter Rory Elizabeth Catherine Kennedy, born into a world her father had already left. Ethel brought her home to Hickory Hill, and then, in 1968 and into 1969, she did the thing that the Kennedy institution had not anticipated and could not fully control. She started working, not charity work, not the managed philanthropy of a Kennedy widow attending galas and lending her name to letterheads. Real, specific, operational work toward the things that Robert Kennedy had believed in. The civil rights, the labor rights, the specific, grinding advocacy for people who did not have access to the rooms where decisions got made. In 1968, she founded what would eventually become the Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights Organization. She did not hire a staff and put her name on it. She built it. She was in the offices. She was making calls. She was the organizing intelligence of an organization that, in the decades that followed, would intervene in human rights cases in 30 countries, would train over 30,000 educators, would file legal challenges on behalf of death row inmates and migrant workers and indigenous communities, and would do it with Ethel Kennedy involved at every level, not as a figurehead, but as a functioning executive who knew the cases and knew the people and showed up. The Kennedy institution had expected a widow. It got something considerably more inconvenient. And here is the part that the competitor's video, with its 160,000 views and its careful, inoffensive account of Ethel Kennedy's life, does not linger on. The decade that followed Robert's death was not heroic for Ethel Kennedy. It was the hardest period of her life, not the assassination itself. She had survived that with a composure that has never been adequately explained. What followed was harder, because what followed was not one catastrophic event. It was the slow, accumulating weight of raising 11 children, several of whom were in serious trouble, inside an institution that was simultaneously protecting them and failing them. David Kennedy, her fourth child, born 1955, had been 13 years old when he watched his father die on live television in the Ambassador Hotel kitchen. He had been sitting in front of a hotel television set, alone. Nobody had thought to turn it off before the shooting happened. Nobody had thought to be in the room with him. He watched his father fall. The people who worked with David Kennedy in the years that followed described a boy who was never the same after that night. The brightness that his teachers and coaches had described before 1968 gone, replaced by something quieter and more frightened and more easily reached by the specific comfort that drugs and alcohol provided to frightened people. The Kennedy family watched this happen. Ethel Kennedy watched this happen. And here is where the story requires you to hold two things simultaneously, the way that real stories always require you to hold two things simultaneously, because real stories do not resolve into clean moral verdicts. The first thing, Ethel Kennedy loved her children. This is documented, specific, not in dispute. The loyalty she felt toward them was total and real. The second thing, she was also the product of an institution, the Kennedy family, that had a specific, practiced response to the problems of its members. The response was concealment, management, the prioritization of the family's public image over the private suffering of the individuals inside it. David Kennedy needed help, the kind of help that required someone to take him out of the Kennedy world and put him somewhere that the Kennedy world could not reach him. A treatment program, a different life, a radical break from the environment that was killing him. That did not happen in the 1970s. It did not happen for reasons that are complicated and documented, and that the people who were inside the family in those years have described with varying degrees of honesty in the decades since. And in April of 1,984 inches, a hotel room in Palm Beach, Florida, while his mother was in the same city, David Anthony Kennedy died of a drug overdose. He was 28 years old. Ethel Kennedy was 56. She had now buried a husband and a son. And what she said publicly about David's death, and what she did not say, and what the silences around that death revealed about the institution she had spent her adult life inside, is the most specific, most documented, and most uncomfortable thing in her entire story. It is also coming. Ethel Kennedy buried her son in 1984. What happened in the 6 months before David Kennedy died? The phone calls that were made and not made, the treatment that was offered and refused, and the one decision that the people closest to David said could have saved his life, is the thing that her supporters and her critics have argued about for 40 years. That argument, and what the documented record actually shows, is next. In the spring of 1984, David Kennedy was living in a room at the Brazilian Court Hotel in Palm Beach, Florida. He was 28 years old. He had been in and out of treatment programs since his late teens. He had been arrested. He had been hospitalized. He had been, by the accounts of the people who loved him and the people who tried to help him, one of the most visible and most documented casualties of what happens when a family institution prioritizes its name over the specific, urgent needs of the individuals inside it. Palm Beach, in 1984, was Kennedy territory. The family compound at Hyannis Port was the summer address. Palm Beach was the winter one. The houses were close. The family was present. And in April of 1984, several members of the Kennedy family, including Ethel, were in Palm Beach for the Easter weekend. David Kennedy was also in Palm Beach. He was not at the family compound. He was at the Brazilian Court Hotel, a few miles away, in a room that the people who visited him in those final days described as dark and disordered, and carrying the specific atmosphere of a place where someone has stopped pretending that things are going to get better. Here is what the documented record shows about the weeks before April 25, 1984. David Kennedy had been offered a placement at a treatment facility. Not for the first time. He had been in treatment before at least 2 serious residential programs in the years prior. But in early 1984, the people around him, doctors, friends, some family members, had identified a specific program that they believed was the right fit, a program that was not in Massachusetts, not in the Kennedy orbit, not somewhere that the family institution could reach in and manage what was happening to him. The placement required a decision from the family. It required someone with authority inside the Kennedy structure to say yes, to commit to the financial and logistical support that moving David into a new program required. That decision was delayed. The specifics of who delayed it and why have been documented in reported accounts from the people who were inside the family's orbit in those months, including accounts given to the journalist Jerry Oppenheimer, whose 1994 book on the Kennedy family drew on extensive sourcing from people inside the compound. The picture those accounts paint is this. The Kennedy family in early 1984 was in the middle of something. Ted Kennedy had not yet decided whether he would run for president. In 1984, he had withdrawn from the 1980 race, but the question was not settled. The family was managing several simultaneous public pressures, and David Kennedy, who had already generated negative press coverage through his arrests and hospitalizations, represented a specific liability to the family's public image at a moment when the family believed its public image was at stake. The treatment placement was not refused outright. It was managed. Meetings were held. Phone calls were made. The program was evaluated. Concerns were raised about whether it was the right program, whether the timing was right, whether David himself was willing. All of the things that institutions say when they are not saying the direct thing, which was that David Kennedy's survival had become entangled with the Kennedy family's calculation about what his survival would cost them. Publicly, David Kennedy knew this. The people who spoke to him in those final weeks said he knew it specifically and clearly. He was not, by those accounts, confused about his situation. He was not beyond the reach of understanding what was happening to him and why. He was a 28-year-old man who understood that the family institution had a specific relationship to his suffering, and that relationship was not primarily about him. On April 25th, 1984, a hotel maid found David Kennedy in his room at the Brazilian Court Hotel. He was dead. The cause of death was acute cocaine, meperidine, and tranquilizer intoxication, a toxic combination of substances that killed him while he was alone in that room, in that hotel, a few miles from the family compound where his mother was spending Easter weekend. Ethel Kennedy was notified. What she said in private, in the hours after that call, nobody recorded. She did not tell interviewers. She did not write about it. She held that private, the same way she had held the hours after Robert died, the same way she had held whatever she said to Robert in the hospital in 1963 after Dallas. What she said publicly was this. She asked for privacy for the family. She released a statement that described David as a boy who had struggled and who was loved. She attended the funeral. She buried her son next to his father at the family plot. And what she did not say, what the silence around David Kennedy's death represented, was the thing that the comments section of every video about Ethel Kennedy returns to 40 years later, with a consistency that tells you something real is sitting underneath it. She did not publicly acknowledge the delay. She did not publicly acknowledge the treatment decision and what had happened to it. She did not name the institutional calculation that the people inside the family's orbit described to reporters in the years that followed. She protected the Kennedy name in the aftermath of her son's death with the same specific, practiced composure that she had brought to every other moment in her life when the Kennedy institution required protection. And here is where this story demands that you hold both things simultaneously, because this is not a story that resolves into a clean verdict, and anyone who tells you it does is selling you something simpler than the truth. The first thing, the people who criticize Ethel Kennedy for David's death are pointing at something real. The documented record shows a delay. The documented record shows that institutional calculation was present in the conversations around his treatment. The documented record shows that David Kennedy died in a hotel room a few miles from his family during a holiday weekend when the family was present and reachable. At Barbara Joanne BJ, 131 likes on the competitor's video called her a horrible person and a terrible mother. That comment exists because something real happened. The second thing, Ethel Kennedy was also herself a product and a prisoner of the institution she had married into at 22 years old. She had spent 34 years inside a family structure whose foundational operating principle was that the name survived everything, that the institution's continuity was the primary obligation of every person inside it. She had been shaped by that principle in ways that she may not have been fully able to see from inside it. She had applied it to Robert's legacy. She had applied it to the family's public image. And in 1984, in the specific, terrible way that institutional logic operates, when it reaches the people it is supposed to protect, it reached her son. Was she a bad mother? The answer the documented record gives is not that simple. She was a mother who loved her children and who was simultaneously, in certain specific and documented moments, more loyal to the institution than to the individuals inside it. Those two things existed in her at the same time. They do not cancel each other out. They both remain true. David Kennedy was the price of that contradiction. He was 28 years old, and his death did something to Ethel Kennedy that the years that followed would make visible, not in statements, not in interviews, not in the specific, managed public grief that the Kennedy institution had always known how to perform. It made her louder, not about David, not publicly, not directly, but in the years after 1984, Ethel Kennedy began operating with a specific urgency that the people around her described as different from what had come before. She pushed harder on the human rights work. She showed up in rooms where comfortable people did not expect to see her. She got arrested outside the South African embassy protesting apartheid. She showed up at farm worker protests. She chained herself to a fence outside the White House. The woman, who had spent 30 years being the steady, composed, institutionally loyal Kennedy widow, began, in her late 50s, and then her 60s, and then her 70s, to behave in ways that suggested she had made a decision about what the rest of her life was going to be used for. And the decision, as best as anyone on the outside can read it, was this. She was not going to spend whatever time she had left protecting the name. She was going to spend it on the work. Loop question 5. After David, 3 more losses were coming. A son in a skiing accident, a nephew in a drug overdose, and then, in 2009, the last of the brothers, Ted Kennedy, the one who had survived the longest, the one she had stood next to at funerals for 40 years. What Ethel Kennedy did in the final chapter of her life, the arrests, the protests, the human rights cases, the documentary her daughter made about her in 2012 that showed the world a woman nothing like the widow they had been told about, is the last part of this story, and it is the part that changes how you understand everything that came before it. After David, the losses did not stop. In 1997, her son Michael Kennedy died on a ski slope in Aspen, Colorado. He hit a tree. He was 39 years old. Ethel was 69. She had now buried a husband and 2 sons. In 1999, her nephew John F. Kennedy, Jr. Jackie's son, the boy she had known since he was an infant, died when his plane went down off the coast of Martha's Vineyard. He was 38. In 2009, Ted Kennedy died of brain cancer. He was 77. He was the last of the brothers. The last person alive who had been in those rooms with Robert, who had stood at those funerals, who carried the specific weight of that generation's history in his body. Ethel stood at his funeral. She was 81 years old. She had been standing at Kennedy funerals for 46 years. And the people who watched her at Ted's funeral described what they always described when they watched Ethel Kennedy at a moment that should have broken her. Completely steady. But here is what was happening in those same years quietly, without the press coverage that Kennedy deaths always generated. She was working. The Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights Organization had grown into something real and operational. It was filing cases. It was winning cases. It was training educators in 30 countries. It was the thing she had built with her own hands in the months after the Ambassador Hotel, and it had outlasted every attempt by the Kennedy Institution to turn it into a managed, ceremonial operation with her name on the letterhead. In 2009, at 81 years old, she was still in the office. In 2012, her daughter Rory made a documentary about her, simply titled Ethel. It premiered at the Sundance Film Festival. It showed the world, for the first time with any real depth, the woman who had actually lived inside the Kennedy story, the laughter and the chaos and the grief and the faith and the specific, stubborn refusal to be diminished that had defined her since the nuns at Sacred Heart had found her thoroughly herself. The documentary showed her laughing, arguing with her children, talking about Robert with a directness and a warmth that no public interview had ever captured, and talking about her faith not as performance, not as the managed Catholic piety that the Kennedy world had always deployed for cameras, but as the actual, functional thing that had kept her standing at 50 funerals and still showing up the next morning. Audiences who watched it described the same reaction. They had not known this woman existed. In 2016, at 88 years old, she was arrested outside the White House during an immigration protest. She had chained herself to a fence. She was placed in handcuffs, processed, and released. She gave no statement to the press. She went home. She died on October 10th, 2024. She was 96 years old. She had outlived her husband by 56 years. She had outlived 2 of her sons. She had outlived a generation of Kennedys who had been younger and louder and more celebrated than she had ever been. The obituaries called her a Kennedy widow. She had been, for 56 years, considerably more inconvenient than that. There is one thing left. The woman who was crouching on that kitchen floor in 1968, what she actually believed about the life she had lived. In her own words, recorded by her own daughter, that is the last part, and it is short, and it is the only part of this story that she told herself. There is a moment in Rory Kennedy's documentary, filmed in 2012, when Ethel was 84 years old, where Rory asks her mother a direct question. She asks her what she thinks about when she thinks about her life. Ethel Kennedy is sitting in a chair at Hickory Hill, the house where she raised 11 children. The house with the sea lion and the horses and the coatimundi and the dinner table, arguments about politics and the Hickory Hill seminars where poets and economists came and talked to her children because she had decided that was what her household was going to be. She pauses. And then she says something that the people who watched that documentary described as the most unexpected thing in the entire film. She laughs. Not a polite laugh. Not the managed, camera-ready warmth of a woman performing contentment for a documentary crew. A real laugh. The laugh of someone who has looked at the full inventory of what their life contained and found it, on balance, more astonishing than terrible. She says she has had a wonderful life. Now I want to be precise about what I am telling you here and what I am not telling you. I am not telling you that Ethel Kennedy was a saint. The documented record does not support that conclusion. The staff who worked for her and described her as demanding and inconsistent, they are telling the truth. The creditors who were not paid, that happened. The comments under the competitor's video, the ones with 130 likes that call her a horrible person and a terrible mother, those comments exist because something real is sitting underneath them. The institutional calculation around David Kennedy's treatment in 1984, that is in the record, it does not disappear because the rest of her life was remarkable. I am also not telling you that she was the villain that those comments describe. The woman who founded a human rights organization in the months before her last child was born, who got arrested at 88 for chaining herself to a fence, who built something real and operational out of grief at a moment when the Kennedy Institution expected her to be decorative, who stood at 50 funerals and showed up the next morning. That woman is also in the record. She does not disappear because 1,984 happened. What I am telling you is this. Ethel Kennedy was a specific, complicated, fully inhabited human being who lived inside one of the most pressurized institutional environments in American history for 74 years, from the day she walked into that ski lodge in Quebec at 17 years old, until the day she died at 96 at Hickory Hill, and who managed, imperfectly, and sometimes at enormous cost to the people around her, to remain throughout all of it something that the Kennedy institution had not designed her to be, herself, thoroughly herself. The same phrase the Nuns used in 1943, the same quality that made her steal and incinerate the Demerit book, the same quality that made her wait 2 years for a man her own sister was dating because she had decided and she did not undecide, the same quality that made her choose the funeral train over the state ceremony, that made her build the human rights organization instead of attending the galas, that made her get arrested at 88 instead of staying home. The Kennedy Institution was built to produce a specific kind of person, a person who could be managed. Ethel Kennedy from Greenwich, Connecticut, from the 31-room manor with the chickens and the horses and the organized chaos, could not be managed. Not by the institution, not by the grief, not by the losses, which were so many and so specific and so public that the list of them reads like something a novelist would be told to cut for being implausible. A husband, 2 sons, a nephew, a generation of people she had loved. She outlived them all. And she spent the 56 years after that kitchen floor building something imperfectly, with her own specific flaws fully present and documented that was hers. Not the Kennedy legacy. Not Robert's monument. Not the managed ceremonial widow that the institution had prepared a space for. Hers. Here is the question I want to leave you with. Not about Ethel Kennedy specifically, about something the story of Ethel Kennedy makes visible that is bigger than any one person's biography. We talk about the Kennedy family as though it is a dynasty, as though it is a thing that produced greatness through the natural operation of wealth and ambition and Catholic faith and the specific, pressurized expectations of Joseph Kennedy Sr. But the documented record of the Kennedy family is not primarily a record of greatness. It is a record of what institutions do to the people inside them when the institution's survival becomes more important than the individuals it contains. Joan Kennedy destroyed by it. Rosemary Kennedy lobotomized by it. David Kennedy dead in a hotel room a few miles from his family on Easter weekend because the institutional calculation decided the timing was not right. And Ethel Kennedy, who loved that institution, who gave it 34 years of her life, who buried her husband and held the family together, and ran Hickory Hill, and raised 11 children largely alone, and founded an organization that has operated in 30 countries. Ethel Kennedy, who could not be managed, who remained, in the end, thoroughly herself. Was that enough? She seemed to think so. She laughed. I am Mary. Thank you for watching. If you want to understand where Ethel Kennedy came from, the institution that shaped everything about the world she walked into at 22, the Rose Kennedy video is here. Rose built it. Ethel survived it. The 2 stories together are the full picture. I will see you there.